Section 3 of Lectures to Young People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lectures to Young People by William B. Sprague. Danger of Evil Company. 1 Corinthians 15:33, Part 1. Evil communications corrupt good manners. Nothing is so valuable to man as his character. This is proverbial even in regard to the present life. Strip him of everything else and leave him with a good conscience, and what will probably attend it, a fair reputation, and all that you do will be comparatively harmless. You may have wounded his sensibility or overcome his resolution, or clouded his worldly prospects, but he has that which, in the end, will be likely to place him above the power of malice. His character is a broad shield, which the arrows of adversity, and even the sting of detraction, can never effectually penetrate. Be his circumstances what they may, the fact that he has a good conscience and a good character may justly render him contented and fearless. But if the character which is formed here be important in its relation to our present existence, it is infinitely more so as it stands connected with eternity. This life is the only period of our probation. It is a school in which we are training for an immortal existence. Every moral action of our lives will exert an influence upon us either in heaven or hell, and the sum of these actions will decide the complexion of our characters, and of course our eternal destiny. If these remarks be just, then it clearly follows that there is no part of our conduct which ought to be considered unimportant. The least departure from duty, the least violation of conscience, may be a seed which will produce a harvest of everlasting woe. It may be the germ of a sinful habit. It may be the first of a progressive series of wicked actions which will extend through eternity. It may prove the outer door to the temple of vice, and he who enters it may reasonably expect to be led on till he has explored all its scenes of pollution and darkness, until he finally sacrifices his immortal soul on the altar of confirmed profligacy. Perhaps there is no influence so uniform and so powerful in the formation of character as that of example. This results from the fact that we are creatures of imitation. There is a principle in our nature which leads us instinctively and from our earliest childhood to copy the manners of those with whom we associate. This, to a great extent, is involuntary, inasmuch that persons have often unconsciously contracted peculiarities of character which, when they were reminded of them, they could instantly trace to the example of some friend. I do not here inquire whether we are more likely, from our constitution, to imitate good or bad examples, but only speak of the general influence of example, of whatever kind, founded on the fact that we are naturally imitative beings. The considerations at which I have now just hinted, viz., that with the characters which we form here, must be connected not only our present but eternal condition, and that there is no influence more powerful in forming these characters than that of example. These considerations, I think, must prepare you suitably to estimate the subject to which I am about to call your attention. I mean the danger of evil company. I wish each one of you to hear for himself, and to let conscience make a faithful and honest application. And it is my earnest prayer to God, and I doubt not that it is the prayer of your parents who are here among you, that you may so listen and so apply, that this discourse shall prove the means of making you better and happier through eternity. That evil company has a corrupting and dangerous effect is a fact so well understood and so universally acknowledged that it would be quite superfluous to enter into direct proof of it. The wisest man in the world has long ago said that a companion of fools shall be destroyed, and who has not seen the assertion verified in instances almost innumerable? It will be more to our purpose, therefore, to show you the process by which evil example operates, or to notice the different principles which it brings into action in corrupting the morals, degrading the character, and ruining the soul. 1. The danger of associating with wicked companions commences in the fact that it renders vice familiar. I know it has been fashionable to say, in the language of a distinguished poet, that vice is a monster of so frightful mien that to be hated needs but to be seen. And on this principle some have gone so far as to justify the most profane and licentious exhibitions of the stage, and have gravely contended that those splendid scenes of impiety, decked out with all that is most attractive and provoking to the sensual appetites, are fitted indirectly to nourish good affections and lead to a virtuous life. The fundamental error of this kind of philosophy is that it overlooks the melancholy fact that man is a being of depraved inclinations, and the moment you bring him in contact with vice, you place by his side a companion to whom his arms and his heart involuntarily fly open. However you will account for the fact, all experience proves that there is a tendency in human nature to go astray, and that while nothing more than the absence of restraint is necessary to the formation of evil habits, a habit of virtue and piety is always the result of fixed resolution and severe effort. If then the state of the heart naturally be such as to render it most sensible to the solicitations of vice, you will easily perceive how this consideration operates to invest all needless intercourse with evil company with great danger. You may apply fire to materials which are exposed to the frost and damps of winter, and you will find it difficult to produce a flame. But if you bring it in contact with some highly inflammable substance, you will see a blaze, or hear an explosion in an instant. In like manner, if all our inclinations were originally on the side of virtue, the danger from being familiar with vice might be comparatively small, but the case becomes greatly changed when it is recollected that we have within us evil propensities, which are ready to kindle as soon as the torch of temptation is applied to them. I am aware that the circumstances of our present condition sometimes necessarily lead us to witness scenes of wickedness. But this, so far as it is unavoidable, is to be considered as constituting part of our trial, and as making a loud demand for our vigilant activity and resistance. But in a large part of the instances in which young persons are the witnesses of vice, it is not because Providence places them in the way of it in the course of their duty, but because they are prompted by inclination. Now let me say that those of you who have yielded so far to curiosity or any other principle as to place yourselves deliberately and unnecessarily in the way of vice, I care not what kind it is, have unconsciously entered into a league with it. The fatal poison is already in your hand, and unless you cast it from you without delay, in all probability you are ruined. 2. It is the tendency of mixing with bad associates to benumb and finally destroy the moral sense. By the moral sense, you will understand me to mean that faculty or principle of action, partly of an intellectual and partly of a moral character, by which we discern the difference between right and wrong, and approve the one and condemn the other. In some, I suppose, this faculty is originally more active and delicate than in others, but in all, it is an essential part of the human constitution and is indispensable to moral agency. It is easy to see that in the formation of character, much will depend on cultivating or neglecting to cultivate it. And of course, whatever contributes to render our moral perception less accurate or our moral sensibility less keen must proportionably put in jeopardy our virtue. Now let me ask whether the voice of universal experience does not decide that mingling in evil company and witnessing evil examples has this unhappy tendency. Have not even persons of an established principle of piety, who have been called, in the course of providence, to mingle in scenes of wickedness, found it exceedingly difficult to maintain that high and awful sense of the evil of sin which they wish to cultivate? And have they not been obliged to fortify themselves against this deadening influence by a double degree of watchfulness and prayer? But perhaps there are some before me who can bear testimony on this subject from experience. Can you not remember the time when some particular vice, say that of profane swearing, or gaming, or drunkenness, excited in you emotions of disgust and even horror, when you could hardly look upon its miserable victim without an aching heart? But it may be that you have since frequently been in vicious company, and the sounds of blasphemy and the riot and loathsomeness of intemperance have become familiar to you. And has not this familiarity rendered you insensible in a great degree to the odiousness of these vices? Nay, are there not some among you who can now commit without much remorse sins, the very thought of which would once have made you tremble? Look back, O young man, and see how far you have already fallen towards the gulf of profligacy and ruin, and then, in the light of your past experience and over the ruins of a good conscience, look forward and prophesy concerning your future doom. The extinction of the moral sense is usually very gradual, and the progress of its decline is often marked with great accuracy by the conduct. Everyone knows that conscience is originally one of the most active and powerful of all the inhabitants of the human breast, and that she will never yield up her authority till she has sustained a severe struggle. There is nothing, perhaps, in which this conflict is more clearly marked than in the progress of a young man who has had a pious education towards a habit of profaneness. Though he has been accustomed occasionally to hear the language of cursing from others, the impressions of his childhood are too strong to allow him immediately to copy it. At length, in an evil hour, he summons resolution enough to make the awful experiment of uttering an oath, but his faltering tongue and blushing cheek proclaim that there is a commotion and a remonstrance within. Conscience rouses up all her energies and thunders out a rebuke which almost puts him into the attitude of consternation. Perhaps his early resolutions to reverence the name and authority of God come thronging upon his remembrance, or perhaps the instructions of other days, enforced by parental effect on, rise up before him. Or it may be that the image of a departed parent, who had trained him up in the way that he should go, haunts his busy and agitated mind, and reproaches him with filial ingratitude. He resolves that the dreadful privilege of taking the name of God in vain has been purchased at too great expense, and that he will not venture to repeat an experiment that has been so fruitful in remorse and agony. But presently he is heard to drop another oath and another, and in each successive instance the conflict with conscience becomes less severe, till at length this faithful reprover is silenced, and he blasphemes his Maker's name without remorse and almost without his own observation. When I see an ingenuous youth taking the first steps in this path of death, when I see his countenance change and hear his voice falter, and the embarrassment and awkwardness of his manner tell me that conscience is uttering her remonstrances at the very moment when the language of profaneness is upon his lips, I say to myself, poor young man, little do you know what disgrace and wretchedness you are treasuring up for yourself. I regard him as having set his face like a flint towards perdition, and I read on his character in dark and ominous letters, "The glory is departed." It is important here to be observed that the effect of any particular vice in destroying the moral sense is universal. That is, by being familiar with any one sin, the mind gradually contracts a degree of insensibility to all others. For instance, if you indulge in profaneness, the sin of licentiousness or drunkenness as an offense against God will not appear to you in its native odiousness, for this plain reason, that by indulging in sin of any kind, you lose your regard for God's authority. There is also such an intimate connection between different vices that it is exceedingly difficult to be devoted to one without being in a greater or less degree the slave of more. Remember, therefore, that in frequenting the company of the vicious, you expose yourselves not only to the particular vices which you may happen to witness in them, but to any others to which subsequent temptations may invite you, because when you have once cast off the fear of God, your heart will be open to every bad impression, and will be a soil in which every kind of sin will flourish luxuriantly. 3. It is another effect of associating with evil company that it checks the operation of the principle of shame, or renders one regardless of the opinion of the world. This, too, is part of our original constitution, and is so essential and active a principle that the absence of it is always taken as a decisive indication of confirmed profligacy, insomuch that there is hardly a more striking epitome of a thoroughly depraved character than that he is without shame. Though some higher principle than a regard to the opinion of the world is necessary to constitute an action good in the sight of God, or to be the foundation of a religious life, and though this principle, like every other, is liable to abuse and needs to be properly restrained and regulated, still no doubt it was intended by Providence to impose a check upon our vicious inclinations, and so essential is its operation to the welfare, and I may say, the existence of society, that if all those evil propensities which are now kept in check by a regard to the opinion of the world were allowed to operate freely, it is probable that all the opposition which human laws could make to the vices of men would be no more than the weakest mound of earth set to defy the angry torrent as it comes rushing from the mountains. If then this principle be so important to the preservation of virtue in the community, and of course to the virtue of every individual, surely anything which has a tendency to extinguish it is greatly to be deprecated, and that this is the direct tendency of evil company must be obvious to everyone. Here again I appeal directly to the consciences of those, if there be any such before me, whose experience renders them the most competent judges. When you first associated with those who took the name of God in vain, would not the thought of your ever being heard to utter the same language have crimsoned your cheek with shame? But after a while, did not this peculiar sensibility to the opinion of the world so far wear off, that when none but your sinful companions were present, you ventured a profane expression, and even after you could swear fearlessly in their presence, was it not a considerable time before you could feel willing to hazard an oath in the hearing of your serious friends? And when, after taking the name of God in vain, you have sometimes turned your face and been unexpectedly met by the reproving countenance of some pious friend, have you not been awed into confusion by the majesty of virtue, and felt that you have done an act which, in the estimation of that good man, would cover you with disgrace? But you may, for aught I know, have long since bid adieu to all such scruples, and you may be congratulating yourselves upon the victory you have gained over a prejudice of education, and you may have become so shockingly familiar with the dialect of hell that even the presence of the virtuous and good cannot restrain you from it, for all this may be calculated upon as a legitimate consequence of being often found in the way of sinners. Just so it is with the sin of intemperance. Probably the greatest drunkard in the community can remember the time when he would have shuddered at the thought of thus foolishly sacrificing his reputation. And perhaps there was hardly ever an instance in which a man yielded to this kind of temptation for the first time, that he was not thoroughly ashamed of it, and would turn his face from you when you met him in the street, lest your countenance should reveal to him your pity or contempt. But by frequently resorting to the company of drunkards, and by repeating a few times the brutish experiment, the flush of shame faded from his cheek, and made way for a still deeper hue of crimson, which proclaims that he is a shameless sot. And so it is with respect to every other bad habit. By frequenting the society of the vicious, a person soon comes practically to regard them as the most important part of the world, and consequently his regard for the opinion of the good and his fear of losing it are gradually diminished and destroyed. End of section 3.